Good day, everybody, and welcome to our short course on the M&A Toolbox, Environmental Risks and Solutions. This is actually the first of the series of short courses that we'll be providing over the coming weeks. There's actually 4 of them that we've designed, and the design of these courses is specifically to do 2 things: to be very specific and give you highly concentrated content on topics that are really material to your day-to-day business climate, and second, to also be very short. Basically 15 to 30 minutes in time so that we can get you that information really in a condensed time frame and get you back to work. So we're starting off with the M&A Toolbox because M&A activity is really robust in the first quarter of 2021. We're actually seeing growth rates over 50% of activity relative to Q1 of last year in North America. So we thought that this would be a really good one to start with. And a second reason is some of the solutions that we'll be doing as an overview in this, we're going to cover in much greater detail in forthcoming short courses that we'll provide. So this is a really good one in that it is timely and it does provide an overview across all the solutions that we'll be discussing. So with that, next slide. So here's our agenda today. What we're going to do is kind of build up, and we're going to talk first about what type of things you should be considering from an environmental perspective when you're doing mergers and acquisitions. We'll talk about the risks that arise in M&A deals, and then we'll talk about the environmental risk transfer solutions that are available to deal with those risks. Your presenters today, I'm Jim Vetter. I'm a managing director at Marsh. I specialize in mergers and acquisitions, brownfields, and complex risks. And I'll turn it over to Kim Mann. She'll introduce herself, and then she'll kick off the beginning of the short course. Kim?
Thanks, Jim. So Kim Mann, Senior Vice President with the Marsh Environmental Practice, also hyper-national focus around mergers, acquisitions, and complex risk, and driving a lot of the solutions we're going to be talking about today for our clients. So why don't we go ahead and get started? So in a merger and acquisition, every deal is very different. And so understanding the factors contractually and the drivers in the deal is really, really critical, especially when you're looking at it from an environmental perspective, because environmental contamination can greatly impact your return on investment if it's not accounted for. So how do we do this? From a very basic perspective, understanding the contractual structure of the deal. Is this a stock purchase where you're acquiring a business, the entity, the liabilities associated with that acquisition? Or is it an asset purchase where maybe it's more focused around the assets and operations going forward? But also just very important to understand that when at a high level, it's either stock or asset, there's a lot of times exceptions built into the deal around environmental. So understanding those, understanding if there's environmental indemnifications in place, if there's prior indemnities from prior deals, how are those being apportioned or reassigned to the benefit of either party within the deal? Are those indemnifications going to capture a potential change in law, or are they as of the time at the closing date of the transaction? Escrow is another thing. How are some of those things potentially being funded? All areas you want to understand. Also, are those in perpetuity, or are they only for a period of time? So as you're working in a transactional environment, understanding not only maybe what has been structured, but also what can be structured and how you can work those to your benefit. When we're thinking about environmental risks, it's critical to get outside of the focus of just operational risk, not just what this company does currently that you're going to have to worry about, but what are some of the larger universe of environmental risks that you could be taking on that we get too focused on the operational and think about sudden accidental or PLL or just some of those narrower items, but the larger universe of environmental risks can all impact your deal. So as you're starting to get into the negotiations, it's really important to understand and know that there are solutions out there that can really help you enable these transactions. So as you're putting together a bid, or you're putting together indemnification wordings, and you're kind of going down certain rabbit holes, thinking about these solutions and how you can use them to your competitive advantage to either win the bid, enable the deal, and have the transaction go forward. And this can be either for shared interests of both parties, individual, whether on the buyer side or the seller side. But again, so much that you can do in order to help facilitate your business. So why don't we keep moving? So where do we start when we're looking at environmental risks? Really, the risks that can present themselves in your deal can have a number of different ways that they've manifested. So if we start with your unknowns, in any deal, you're going to have certainly a nice robust amount of due diligence. But that doesn't mean that there can't be unknown conditions that you could be assuming in that deal. So, what potentially is manifesting on site, migrating off site, and how could potential remediations or resulting business income interruption ultimately impact your transaction. Third-party claims is another big one. And this really comes into whether it's an unknown condition that results in a claim, or also even known conditions that can result in claims. Because as we know, latent and gradual conditions are not going to be just picked up on a general liability. So thinking about potential toxic tort and large claims and resulting legal defense bills certainly can impact your financials on the deal. Similar with natural resource damages. Again, whether the contamination is unknown or even potentially if it's known, if you get hit with a natural resource damage assessment from a regulator, that's going to escalate costs that you wouldn't have been accounting for. Certain jurisdictions and states across the country are a lot more active. So as you're going through diligence and looking at all the different possibilities, a state like New Jersey is much more likely to potentially present this risk. So again, really just understanding eyes wide open when going into a transaction. From a divested properties perspective, we talked a little bit about stock purchase versus asset. In a stock deal, it's possible or likely that you might be assuming liability for previously divested assets. So making sure that you understand what those are and if there's potential environmental liability that could boomerang back to you from those divested properties, again, just something you want to understand in your diligence. Non-owned disposal sites is another one where a company owns their waste from cradle to grave. And so, especially if you're assuming that liability from a legacy perspective, what have you picked up? Have you quantified that within your deal and your structure? So switching gears to the known conditions. A lot of transactions, especially in today's environment, in an industrial setting, are going to have known remediation projects. And so while the seller has their diligence, the buyer has theirs, and you all come to agree on a number within your deal, what is the possibility that the X dollars that you budgeted become Y dollars, and how is that overrun going to be managed and potentially impact your financials? Your PRP sites, where you're one of many parties contributing to an environmental cleanup, is another one. So just because you have a number from your allocation of the total cleanup, there's a number of factors that could cause that allocation to go up, whether it's certain other parties becoming insolvent, the overall cleanup value increasing, it being determined down the line that your contribution to the contamination was much larger and therefore your cost goes up. Again, just different ways that the known conditions can become much higher than you would have planned for. Asbestos, and this one is certainly not new. We've known about asbestos for a long time, but a lot of times it tends to be forgotten as a risk that can be, number one, identified, and number two, addressed. And especially when we get into maybe some of those second or third tier type defendants that aren't living and breathing with asbestos claims every day. It's maybe a smaller part of the liabilities, but still something to be aware of. And this could be any kind of company that, from a product liability perspective, manufactured, distributed, or installed the product. You've got premises liability, secondary exposure. So a lot of factors that can drive asbestos liability into the deal, and something you want to make sure you're taking account for. One of the things about asbestos is some of your smallest little tuck-in acquisitions can come with some of the biggest and most significant asbestos liability. Counterparty credit risk. So we talk, again, going back to the deal structure, do you have an indemnification? And if you do, that's great. But also understanding kind of what is that indemnity worth. if the financials of that performing party aren't there. So again, whether it's insolvency or a number of other factors that can drive another party not to perform, is this a concern for you specifically around environmental liability, unknowns or knowns that could again impact the deal? And finally, we get to everyone's favorite, the operational risk. So of course, what's this business doing? How could this business operation impact the environment? And what are the potential losses from it? So let's move on here and talk a little bit about solutions. So the good news is there's a lot of solutions that you can deploy in your transactions to help support them. And we really like to think about it in two buckets. So you have your unknowns, which are things we don't know about or things that maybe haven't happened yet. And then you have your knowns, and how can those knowns escalate and ultimately cost more money, and how do you manage them? So we're going to talk about these solutions today in our M&A toolbox, that really these things can be available to you in any type of deal. So we're going to move on, and we'll start off with the pollution legal liability, which is our bread and butter product in the environmental insurance market. So when you're looking at the deal, what can a PLL cover? The answer is almost anything and everything you want to look at, a la carte or all in. So you can look at single site, portfolio of sites, divested, non-owned disposal, transportation. Again, whatever is driving your deal, a PLL can be crafted to really respond to those specific situations. It can ensure your legacy issues, so a lot of those things that we talked about that may be manifesting already, but it can also, if you're on the buyer side, be structured to ensure the operational risks all in one. If there are indemnification provisions where you're receiving an indemnity, the PLL also has the ability to endorse that excess of indemnity. So essentially, if there is a failure of contractual obligations by your counterparty, again, for unknowns or for knowns, this policy can also be structured to backstop that. 10-year deals are getting done every day, and it's a great horizon from an environmental perspective, as we know these conditions can have a long-term effect. So 10-year deals from a PLL perspective is something that we typically will see in a transactional setting. There's also ample capacity that's still available, and it's going to depend on your deal, number one, for what's available and what you're going to want to look at. But there's still a lot of really broad capacity within the marketplace. And these policies are going to cover, again, what's driving your deal. If you want to go all in from a core coverages and optional coverages perspective, you can do that. If there's certain things you want to laser in on to focus in and make sure that those things get addressed only, you can do that too. So really, again, a very powerful product in the marketplace. All right, so we're going to move into asbestos, and I'll start by saying is yes, there are solutions for known asbestos claims. Really falls into two main buckets. So at a very high level, the first is your adverse development cap. So this is a situation where you're going to take the asbestos risk in the deal. You're going to understand it through any actuary you do. Hopefully you've identified as many historical GL or umbrella assets that are going to maybe come and be your first line of defense. And this cap, what it's going to do is, based on all of that understanding and analysis, they're going to set an attachment point and say, okay, you keep everything under that attachment. You're going to manage the claims, you're going to subrogate on the existing insurance. But if the value of the claims exceeds a self-insured retention point, that's when this insurance product will step in and it will pay claims above that, again, protecting you from essentially an overrun in adverse development on the asbestos claims. These policies are especially unique because they do not have a policy term. So once you've paid the premium, which in a transactional setting often gets built right into your deal, these policies will be in place until the limits erode. They're also assignable, which makes them great from an investment horizon perspective. So they can be a powerful tool for you on the front end of your deal, but they can also be helpful and assignable on the back end if you're looking to make a sale down the road. The cost for this product is your premium. So you're going to pay a price per mil based on how much limits you end up purchasing. So the second product is your loss portfolio transfer. Very similar concept in that it has no policy term and it is assignable down the line. The key difference is that the insurer is going to take everything from dollar one. So they're going to pay all claims from dollar one. They're going to manage and subrogate against any existing insurance on your behalf. Essentially, they step into your shoes. Fundamentally, the difference between this product and the adverse development cap really comes into your costs, because you're going to be pre-funding essentially all of the existing and forecasted claims, as well as buying the premium for the overrun type of insurance in the limits above what is projected and forecasted. So again, two solutions, whether it's a cap or a full transfer, that can help you, number one, wrap your arms around the asbestos, and number two, protect your financials on your deal. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim. So he's going to talk about some actual similar solutions on more of the environmental remediation side.
Thanks, Kim. As Kim mentioned, PLL is the workhorse and it covers the unknown pre-existing conditions. But there's a whole other bucket, as she had mentioned, of risks around known cleanup conditions. So we've got a pollution condition, it requires to be cleaned up. And in an M&A context, it's the hot potato. Nobody wants it because it has big risks of cost overruns. So we may have an estimate of what we think the cost is to do something today. But again, it's an engineering estimate. If we look at 10Ks and people's experience over time, usually those cleanup costs escalate. So everybody's trying to figure out what we can do with them. So what we're going to talk about is really two solutions for managing those known cleanup conditions. So the very first one is cost cap insurance. Cost cap's been around since the late 90s, had undergone a renaissance in the last 9 years. And here's how it works. Just say if we look at this example graphic here on the left, we have an expected cost of remediation. The carrier will take that cost, as well as what we believe the schedule to complete the remediation is and a scope of work. And they'll engineer it and they'll say, okay, based upon we see this thing looks pretty good. Then what they'll do is they'll never want to attach right at your number, because that's what caused cost cap to flame out years ago. So what they'll do is they'll add what's called a buffer. That buffer could range on average anywhere between 20 to 40%. So for example, if we had a $10 million cleanup, a 20% buffer would be $2 million. If you add the expected cost of remediation and the buffer together, that's called the attachment point. So basically if we take the 10 plus the 2, that's 12 million. And the way it works is if we have a project and it goes over budget and exceeds that attachment point and hits the limits of insurance, the policy pays. So it's a way to basically box in costs. It can cover, as you can see here on the right-hand side, a lot of different things. The degree of contamination is greater than estimated. It could also be off-site. There could be unidentified contaminants. There could be changes in cleanup standards that occur, and we see that quite a bit. Look at what's happened with PFAS and related compounds over the last 5 to 6 years. And there could be just governmental change in cleanup requirements. There may just be an efficacy issue where the remediation's not working and the regulator comes in and says, you know what, you got to do something different. And that different means more costs. So the good news is this product is pretty flexible. You can go out for as long as 10 years. So unlike PLL, which if you make a claim during the policy period, will keep paying, cost cap covers a 10-year period. When you hit the end of the 10 years, it shuts off. So it's really important to kind of understand what your spend horizon is going to look like. There's an awful lot of capacity out there. There's at least 4 markets that are providing primary coverage, plus there's others that are providing excess, and you can easily build up $50 million in capacity. The rate online, it's more expensive than PLL. Looks a lot more like what Kim talked about with asbestos. Rates online are going to be about 15 to 20%. So every million of insurance is going to run about $150,000 to $200,000. But if you do look at the claims that have occurred in the past, when those rates online were paid, this is actually a really good product relative to your return on investment. So that's cost cap. Let's look at the next solution for what we can do around knowns. Next slide. The next solution is an environmental liability buyout. So again, if we go back to what we do during these transactions, it's always going to be who's going to take what risk, who's going to end up having the liability and then having to deal with that, managing that overrun risk. There's a third option, which is basically the buyout. And what the buyout is simply is bringing in a specialty risk transfer company that will come in do the due diligence on the known cleanup liabilities. And then for a price, they will assume that liability contractually. So now you're basically stripping the liability out of the deal and away from buyers. So now instead of buyer and seller having to figure out who's going to take it, neither have to take it. We can strip the liability out of the deal. What's nice about it is the liability assumption is in perpetuity. So once they take it, it's theirs. So you're not limited by time. They take on a whole host of risks. So not only do they take on the cleanup costs, they're taking on the management costs associated with it, the legal defense costs. So there's all those frictional costs that you're dealing with as an organization go away along with that cleanup cost. What it does require is the full funding of the remediation costs. Where cost cap, you're kind of assuming costs up to a certain point, and then the insurance pays. With the buyout, what you have to do is pay them the net present value of the cleanup plus some risk transfer fee on top of that. So you do have to have the cash in advance. But it is a really powerful solution to being able to, get rid of a risk if you just don't want to manage it going forward and you want to focus on your core competencies around your business. Next slide. That's the end of the presentation. Hopefully you found this really informative. It's given you a good overview of what the circumstances are with M&A, the risks, and the solutions. If you have any follow-up questions, here's the contact information for myself and Kim. As we mentioned at the beginning of the program, this is the first in a series of courses. You'll be getting invites to participate in future courses that are going to go into a lot more detail, specifically on the asbestos liabilities, cost cap, as well as counterparty credit risk. So hopefully you'll be able to join us on those future programs. With that, thank you very much and have a good day.